Thank you, Dr. Pramod. Good morning, all. I'm based in Stockholm, and it's still very dark. It's 8:30 in the morning, and as you know, it's the Nordic winter, Stockholm winter. So it's still very dark, and I'm sorry if you cannot see me properly because this is the best light I could have at my home right now. But glad to be here, and thank you very much for Dr. Pramod and nice. For organizing this and inviting me to chair this interesting webinar, this session. And I think I was listening some part of the discussion from the last session, and I must say that the more we discuss about Indo-Pacific, more we are puzzled. And here there are two big powers who are continuously trying to make their headways to Indo-Pacific, that is China and Russia. And we have discussed in some length in India, I think India and elsewhere, more about China and Indo-Pacific, given their outreach, given their Belt and Road initiatives, given their maritime Silk Road strategy, and also the way the Chinese have reached out to different sub-regions of Asia or in the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia to South Asia to Middle East to other parts of Indian Ocean regions. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, I think we're still trying to judge to what extent Russia is an influential actor, how Russia is going to, reach out to the regions, and what impact Russia, along with China, the kind of chemistry they are building up for last 2-3 years, particularly following the Russia's attack on Ukraine. What kind of chemistry is emerging in Indo-Pacific, and how does that really going to influence the Indo-Pacific narrative? In order to discuss this, I think we have a fantastic line of speakers. We have Professor Anuradha Chenoy. She's a very known expert and scholar on China and Russia, particularly on Russian affairs, and she'll be going to speak about Chinese and Russian counter reaction to the US in the Indo-Pacific. Then we have Dr. Peng Nian, Director of Hong Kong Research Center for Asian Studies in Hong Kong. Then we have Dr. Gudrun Wacker, non-resident fellow SWP in Germany. I had the good pleasure to meet her in a couple of days before, just a couple of days back in Berlin. Then we have Dr. Ekaterina Koldunova. She's associate professor at Moscow State Institute of International Relations, Russia. We have Mr. Michael Kovrig, senior advisor of Asia International Crisis Group. He is going to talk about China's game of influence in the Pacific Island, which is very interesting. Then we have Dr. Petr Topychkanov, who is the head of the sector of new challenges in South and Southeast Asia. And currently, he's associated with the Institute of World Economy and International Relations in Russia. He is going to touch upon nuclear dimensions. And then we have Dr. Roger Liu, who is from National Yat-sen University in Taiwan. Now, I'll start in the same order, and I would request each of the speakers probably to keep it 10 minutes or so, 10 to 12 minutes, so that we get more time for discussion. So I'll start with Professor Chenoy to speak on your topic, particularly addressing how do you really see China-Russia confluence in Indo-Pacific. If there is an confluence in Indo-Pacific emerging, then how is it really going to impact the narrative, and what kind of reactions or counter reactions we are going to see in the Indo-Pacific region? Over to you, Professor Chenoy.
Thank you. Professor Panda, dear Pramod, co-panelists and friends at NICE. I'm indeed grateful to be here on this very challenging topic. So I think in this 10 minutes, what I'm quickly going kind of focus on is first context in which Russia and China are building these synergies and what their kind of counter reactions are, as I would call it, to what is happening in the region. First of all, I think there's no doubt that the US believes that it is and wants to be the primary hegemonic power in the Indo-Pacific. Because since the Second World War, even during the bipolar system, the USSR, the Soviet Union, was primarily engaged with balancing the US in Europe and in the Third World. While the US was the primary power in the Pacific region with a network of alliances, interventions, and wars in Southeast Asia, Laos, Vietnam, etc. Then at the end of the bipolar system, and US unipolar primacy meant that the US started enjoying unprecedented global hegemony without opposition to its expansive security choices. Now, with this unipolarity, I will focus on one policy and three impacts. The one policy was that with this kind of triumphalism, the shift in economics and political economy to globalization that combined neoliberal reforms, financialization, shift of manufacturing to the East, whereas they retained the monopoly over knowledge and information and tech products through the internet, the patents regime. So there were three impacts that we need to see out here. The first impact was that globalization worked to the advantage, first of all, to China, that saw this fast-paced growth in manufacturing. And according to the IMF, accounted for 28% of all growth worldwide, 2013 to 18 alone, twice the share of the US. The second trend was that after 2001, Russia started stabilizing, much of it not recognized in the world. They use their oils and commodity to revive their military and industrial side complexes and export of military industries. India was a major buyer of that, along with many others in Southeast Asia. The third trend was that some of the developing countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, and some of the ASEAN tigers, they became the middle level powers and emerging economies and started having a common understanding of the shifts in the international system. So there were two parallel geostrategic shifts. The first was the US reaction to these developments, and it came in the form of the slogan of pivot to Asia, and the redomination of the neocons and the national security doctrine, whereby the US, which always had an interest in the Pacific, their interest became, they wanted to retain this hegemony, and because it is, after a very important route, and I think the first session showed that. And every national security document in the US since 2008, 2009 saw these threats where China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, all of which are around this this constructed term of Indo-Pacific and terrorism were a major threat. So, for example, in 2020, the national security strategy of the Republic of China, only competitor, the United States, the intent and increasingly the capacity to shape the international order. So the US national defense strategy, alongside with this strategy, calls it the pacing challenge, which they have to, kind of look at. The second shift was that these countries outside the West, the emerging countries, along with Russia and China, they formed this kind of loose pact and got invested in the idea of multipolarity and a redistribution of the concentrated political power. And then the other event and impact of all this was the operationalization of the US agenda, the proxy war in Ukraine, which really does a lot of quick, much faster shifting of these policies, where the US then at that time sought to strengthen NATO and increase its operations in the Indo-Pacific. So the US, it always has, and increasingly then is very much linked to the hotspots in this region, whether it's Taiwan, the contested islands of the South China Sea, and the Korean Peninsula and the Philippines. And it has built a framework, a network of alliances like the Quad, the new US, Japan, the Republic of Korea trilateral, the 4 new bases in the Philippines. So with all this, Russia and China have had very strong reactions. So China's methodology is twofold. One, to continue with its economic strategy and economic buildup, that is primary, unlike Russia, which is more focused on geostrategy and security. So this fits in to their compatibility, if they have an understanding, and which they do. So China continues with its Belt and Road and it's building up, but at the same time, China is also developing its military capability. China, whose naval power has taken over the US and is in this region alone. So it's focused on this region. It's not in every, all over the world like the US is. And with that, they seek a rejuvenation of the Chinese nation through political, social, and military modernity. And they see US as deploying, and what they used in the 20th Party Congress was a whole government effort to contain the PRC's rise, because this is an obstacle to US national strategy. And so they call for building a community of common destiny to revitalize the PRC. And you must have seen their naval documents, and the US defense last strategy of 2023 does an excellent analysis of this, where they show that now the PLA numerically is the largest navy in the world with 370 ships and submarines and etc. And it has the capacity to assert its presence, especially in the South China Sea. And they tried to build some security alliances, as with the Solomon Islands, but in my opinion, this backfired because it led to the US security and economic deals with 3 Pacific islands, Papua New Guinea, Palau, and Micronesia. So as far as Russia is concerned, earlier they didn't focus that much on the Far East, but now they see themselves as a Pacific power. Their new policies are focusing on the Far East. They have already built this new shipping routes like Vladivostok to Chennai, which is very active. India is a partner in that. The North Sea Arctic route, in which China has a great interest. And as they've stated in their Far East Economic Forum, where both the Chinese, Indians, and many Southeast Asian countries are present. So these countries feel, and their policy is that they can take advantage of both China and Russia. India, of course, doesn't want to take it. I mean, it has a competition and still a somewhat, conflictual relation with China, which is improving, but nonetheless, they do have positions of neutrality, and they have a lot of similar thinking on this region, along with what the ASEAN countries and others say. And my last point, therefore, is the strategic link or the strategic understanding, because between China and Russia. Recently, I did visit Moscow, where we had a Russia, India, China dialogue, academic dialogue. And one could see the levels of Russia-China relations go very deep into the system. It's not just a convergence of geostrategic interest. There is a dialogue on technology, on history, on discourse, on information, on hypersonics, you name it, on everything. So there is this deep understanding, which is going, the value chains which Russia had with the West, they are broken. They have had a difficult time, but now they are with the East, and they are functioning very well. They're really very linked, and I think that they could have a collective response in the Indo-Pacific. They understand each other's strategic constraints, challenges, and methodologies, and the way forward. So it's very deep. And luckily for them, all of the ASEAN and South Asia, they're interested in their own development. They don't want to take sides. While there are and could be escalations and spirals, one side, the US and NATO increasing their military expenditures, but the powers that temper this are the rest of the Asian powers and their neutrality. So that's where I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those are interesting remarks, and I'm sure there will be some comments. But your point about how the Chinese have really focused more on the geo-economic strategy. At the same time, they are building up their maritime capability. And on the other hand, Russia is still looking for geostrategic maneuvers in Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure their different approaches are seen differently by many Indo-Pacific countries. And I'm sure there will be different interpretation about these two power strategy. With this note, let me invite the next speaker. I don't see her name. Dr. Peng Nian, Director of Hong Kong Research Center of Asian Studies in Hong Kong. You're there. Please unmute your into video, and I invite you to make the presentation for 10 to 12 minutes. Dr. Peng Nian? I don't think we have the speaker with us in this panel. I think the speaker has not yet joined. So let's move to the next speaker, Dr. Gudrun Wacker. Maybe she could provide a little more about European perspective, how Europe is looking at China and Russia in Indo-Pacific, their current and future role, and particularly where does Germany, visualize all of these things as you are based there in one of the prominent think tanks. Over to you, Dr. Wacker.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, although it's early in Europe. I selected this panel because it's not the earliest one, but thanks for having me. I thought I would make 3 points, and of course I'm speaking from a European perspective. I will talk about China's main goals in the region, Russia's, and what are they doing together in the Indo-Pacific. I have one preliminary remark, and I think it's important to say that neither Russia nor China subscribe to this concept of the Indo-Pacific. There is no official document in which the Chinese would use this because from the Chinese perspective, it's associated with the Quad and with this whole effort or perceived effort of the United States to contain China. So there is no use. There is in academic literature you can find Indo-Pacific, but not in official documents. Now, I think some things about China have already been said, but let's start with what is the main focus of China in the Indo-Pacific, if we call it that. I think it's Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. So East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, this is where China has its maritime claims and territorial claims to certain islands in the East China Sea, to Taiwan unification, and South China Sea, where it basically claims the whole maritime area. So these are the focal points from the Chinese perspective. And then the Indian Ocean is more the linkage to Africa. There are investments in ports, etc. And we have to say that China has very deep economic intertwinement with the region, including with the allies of the United States in the region, Japan, Korea, Australia. They all have very strong economic links with China, which, despite the efforts to diversify away from China, this is not so easily done. It was already mentioned that China now has the biggest navy in the world. I think since the 1990s, it has been very systematic in building up this blue water navy, in contrast to the coastal defense they were focusing on before. So this is basically aimed at pushing for their maritime claims in the East China Sea to the South China Sea, and of course also to make the claim of Taiwan credible. But the ambitions go beyond. We see the investments in ports, for example, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and with Djibouti, China also has a first military base abroad in the Middle East. So we see the ambition, and we have to say that also China is a member of all regional organizations, at least all the ones that are centered around Southeast Asia. So the ARF, ADMM Plus, East Asia Summit, they're a member of APEC and also a central part of the Free Trade Agreement, RCEP. So I would say the approach of China to the region is a very comprehensive one. The economic footprint is strong, military presence is strong, diplomatic efforts, and there is also a dimension of coercive power, which China uses on a regular basis if countries don't behave, so to speak. And the main goals are unification with Taiwan, pushing through the maritime claims and limit the influence of the United States. Now with Russia, it's very different because the economic footprint of Russia in the region is, compared to China, relatively small. Russia also joined in the second half of the 90s these regional organizations, including APEC, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM Plus, and East Asia Summit. But economically, it has a much more limited impact in the region. Basically, it's about arms sales. And here the old friends of Russia come into play very strongly, India and Vietnam. And then, especially after the invasion of Ukraine, energy is also a major economic dimension for Russia, where basically China and India replace the broken European supply chain we have heard before. And all this also demonstrates that that Russia is not as isolated as the Europeans would like it to see with the sanctions and everything. And then this brings me to my third point and last point. What are China and Russia doing together? The previous speaker already talked about the deep links between China and Russia and the convergence of views. I would say the convergence has limits, but also this relationship and partnership has not fallen from the sky. It has been built up gradually in the 1990s, from the 1990s, early 1990s onward, and we already see in the second half of the 90s some of the elements, the criticism of the US, NATO, the alliance system as remnants of the Cold War. These elements are already there in the 1990s. And we see that also China and Russia often speak with a unified, whether coordinated or not, voice in these regional organizations when it comes to crisis prevention or conflict prevention, for example. But the main cooperation we see are military exercises. That's very clear. Since 2003, there have been over 100 military exercises jointly held by China and Russia. In the beginning, probably more arms sales shows from the Russian side, but now it's really military exercises where both parties show. First of all, Russia shows that despite the war in Ukraine, it can still do this kind of scale of maritime and aerial exercises. So these exercises take place in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, but also in the Baltic Sea, in the Gulf of Finland, and even in the Mediterranean. And then we have trilateral exercises that include Iran, and one exercise that included South Africa. So I think this is a clear signal from both sides that they sort of mutually support their respective core interests, if you will. But it also shows that the European theater and the East Asia theater, if you want to call it that, are linked together. And the latest signal or symbol of this linkage between these two theaters is the inclusion of North Korean soldiers in the war in Ukraine. And I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think excellent remarks again. And I think I do agree with your point that both the powers are doing a lot of military exercises, and the intent is very clear. They want to prepare for the future, and they want to have these partnerships maybe as a challenging partnerships to the narrative that is building in Indo-Pacific. We'll come back to you with more to share your European and German perspective maybe. With this note, let me invite the next speaker in line. That is Dr. Ekaterina Koldunova. Over to you for 10 to 12 minutes, maybe more from a Russian point of view.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for inviting me to this panel, and thanks to the organizers for preparing this conference. I will be speaking about, I will try to speak about Russia's perspective on the Indo-Pacific. Gudrun was absolutely right, mentioning that there is no official usage of the concept, and moreover, the concept itself is reduced to the one which is usually voiced by the United States and its allies. So the official counter-reaction of Russia to the idea of the Indo-Pacific is obvious not to use it in the official discourse. But let me speak about 3 points which I want to share with you. The first one will be about the tyranny and logic of geography in Russia's foreign policy. I just want to explain an idea that Indo-Pacific is not the only direction of Russia's attention, and Russia is actually too big to reduce its geostrategic outlook to just Indo-Pacific. But since the conference is about the Indo-Pacific, let's then contemplate about Russia's Asian policy and the role of this area in its turn to the East. And point number 3 will be about Russia's perceptions of the Indo-Pacific idea. I would say in theory and in practice, again, because of course the academic community has been debating this concept for many, many years and looked at it from multiple angles. But the practice of the foreign policy making, of course, will have its own nuances and differences. So the logic of geography. Apologies for reminding you again that Russia is the biggest country in the world in terms of geographical constellation, but also the figures before 2022 showed that it was number 6 in the group of upper middle income economies, number 9 in the group of countries with the biggest population, and number 11 among countries with the largest domestic product. 2022 was an important point, because totally different processes started to develop in the Russian economy, which reinvigorated it in some sense. But that's not the topic of my talk today. I just want to emphasize that the whole economic system has been going through very profound shifts recently. One more important thing, which relates to geography, it's that Russia is the biggest westernized non-Western country with several centuries old tradition of aspirations to become an integral part of Europe. And these aspirations are seemingly came to an end after massive sanctions were imposed on Russia after the after conflict in Ukraine entered its very hot phase in February 2022. So what's about Asian policy? Logically, when sanctions started to being imposed, Russia turned to Asia in more real meaning of this term, not just discursively, as it was the case before 2022, and started to look to the partners beyond Europe and beyond the so-called collective West. Since this panel has been debating the role of China and Russia in the Indo-Pacific, of course, we should mention here that China quite naturally became the primary object of reinvigoration of Russia's turn to the East. And of course, Gudrun is absolutely right that these relations have not come just, out of the blue. They were developing for quite a while. Of course, there are different points of view which are proposed in the academic literature, in the policy making, both in Russia and in the foreign countries, that this is a marriage of convenience, this is not a lasting relationship. But let me say one thing, that of course, there should be limits. Of course, there should be some difficult issues, because both Russia and China are big countries, and they have important interests all over the world, with China going global recently. And naturally, there might be disagreements. But at the same time, there are structural elements which unite both countries, and the previous speakers, I think, have highlighted quite a number of these important structural things which unite them. Next, I would say India is an important partner, but of course, we also should make the same comment to India as we made to China, that India is a big pan-Asian country, minimum, maybe a country with the future of strong global player. And of course, it has its own set of interests depending on its geographical outlook, geostrategic and geoeconomic outlook. And number three, I would say ASEAN in Asia, but of course, we should also mention here just integration project. Quite recently, the development that some ideas which Russia and China have been elaborating, and Russia, China, and India have been elaborating for a while. I mean, the trilateral cooperation between within the framework of Russia, China, India have attracted more interested countries, and hence the BRICS outreach process started to develop quite quickly. But again, it's not the main focus of my talk today. So what about Russia's perception of the Indo-Pacific in theory and in practice? I should tell you that, of course, the academia have been debating this counterposition, physical versus functional geography, for quite a while. And of course, there were studies and research focus on the economic and strategic linkages emerging in what some of my colleagues and me called Greater Eastern Asia. We meant that actually there are serious regional transformations in the making, which lead to macro-regionalization. But in the 2010s, we focused mainly on the growing economic interdependence between India and East and Southeast Asia. So if the developments in the international relations were going into more constructive direction, we would have seen Indo-Pacific forming based on the geo-economic foundations rather than on the geopolitical. But unfortunately, after 2017, when the United States have officially taken the Indo-Pacific idea into its strategic documents, this macro-regionalization went along the geopolitical lines. So what worries Russia about the Indo-Pacific? I'm sure that some of the audience members are well aware of them, but still I will make some bullet points. Number one is Asiatization of NATO, so to say, multilateralization of American alliances in the region, intelligence sharing, and everything which makes these alliances more interconnected, emergence of minilaterals like Quad, and more importantly AUKUS, which some of my senior colleagues US CENTO 2.0, possible erosion of Indian neutralism, question mark here, the anti-Chinese and anti-Russian developments of this macro-regionalization, the rising risks of strategic and non-strategic miscalculations, because the more we look at the region in the geopolitical context, the more the militarization is going on in the region, the higher the risks of miscalculations. Questions about the future of nuclear-free zone in Southeast Asia, but my colleague Petr, I think, would be speaking in more details about that. And actually, the question about where is Asia in all this Indo-Pacific framework, because we see increasing role of non-Asian players in all this constellation. I think that I have exhausted my time, so thank you, Chair, for providing the opportunity to speak, and I will probably stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think these are pertinent comments, particularly looking from Russia's point of view, both in the theoretical context as well as in practical context. And I think no matter Russia acknowledges officially the concept Indo-Pacific or not, but in practice, I think Russia is emerging as a significant player in the Indo-Pacific narrative in terms of at least in terms of executing its outreach in the regions. And that is what none of the Indo-Pacific powers could probably overlook to it. We will come back to you during the Q&A. I'm sure there will be some comments about your presentation. But let me now move to the next speaker, Michael Kovrig. Over to you. Maybe you could provide a picture about how the Chinese are expanding their influence in the Pacific Island. So 10 to 12 minutes. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yeah. So
great. So I just want to thank our hosts at NICE for giving me the opportunity, and very happy to be here with so many colleagues. I've spent much of the last 18 months or so doing research on the Pacific Islands, including extensive travel and interviews in the region. And I'm in the process of finalizing a report for Crisis Group on the region. So what I'd like to do here is just share a few highlights from it. One thing I would note is that although the islands are relatively remote and distant from most of the areas many of the rest of you focus on, I think even if you don't care what happens to the Pacific Islands, they provide a fascinating case study in China's interactions with smaller states and many of the tactics and strategies that it employs. So I would encourage you to look at it in that regard as well. The Pacific Islands are often described as small and remote, but those labels miss the point entirely. For China, it's a vast maritime domain with exclusive economic zones that span 29 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the entire African continent. And for China, that means it's a critical theater of influence between the second and third island chains. It fits into Indo-Pacific geostrategic concepts that are being applied by the Western powers that China is increasingly in rivalry with, but it also fits into Chinese strategic thinking as a kind of more distant periphery. And the degree to which China can have influence in that region, particularly through the second and third island chains, that has implications for its ability to achieve dominance and sea control and overall a sphere of influence in the Western Pacific or its near seas. So these, the pieces are all interlocking, right? And it also, as a region itself, similarly to the South China Sea, it offers vital resources, strategic sea lanes, and a pathway potentially to disrupt traditional power balances. Let's keep in mind that for the Chinese, the PLA Navy, to get out to the blue Pacific and really become a global actor, it needs to pass through the EEZs of other states almost entirely. So what happens in the Pacific and who holds the balance of influence there is relevant also to China's global ambitions and also in a number of other ways. So China's role in the Pacific is the result of decades of calculated strategy. It's guided by ambitions to reshape global power dynamics, and it's being deliberate and assertive. It has a strategy. It's employing targeted diplomacy, debt-driven economic engagement to expand its influence. It's using elite capture and dual-use infrastructure. It's embedding itself as a dominant player. And the tactics reveal a methodological approach to deepen a foothold and reshape the region. And it's doing so through diplomatic, economic, and security sector means. So let me just touch on those three briefly. But one framework that one could maybe for a little fun apply to it is if you have any familiarity with the Japanese game Go, or in Chinese as it's known, Weiqi. I think that metaphor in this case is kind of useful for thinking about that methodical and incremental strategy, but particularly securing small but significant positions to shape the broader landscape. So it's not so much about a chess game of one party or the other is going to win or lose. It's playing for advantage and filling in empty spaces on the board where your influence is greater than your opponent's. And in the Pacific, that entails expanding presence through infrastructure projects, economic cooperation agreements, and security partnerships. It's not primarily a military competition, but rather one of geopolitical influence. And while China's initiatives promise development and connectivity, they often come with hidden costs, including eroding governance, creating dependency, and in some cases, even threatening sovereignty. So the stakes include not just resources and trade routes, but the ability of Pacific nations to chart their own independent futures. Let's talk about diplomatic and political influence for a moment. China's diplomatic efforts have intensified over the last 2 decades, built ties through aid, investments, high-profile visits. It's worked systematically, particularly since 2006, to isolate Taiwan, persuading nations like Kiribati and the Solomon Islands to switch diplomatic recognition, more recently Nauru as well. And it's not just about symbolism, it's about constraining Taiwan's international space and consolidating power and asserting its own legitimacy. China now has more accredited diplomats in the Pacific than any other country, and their average rank and experience has increased over the past decade. 8 Pacific Island countries have signed comprehensive strategic partnership agreements with China as a signal of deeper political and economic alignment. In the United Nations General Assembly, for example, on average, over the last decade, or actually after the last 2 decades, Pacific nations have aligned with China's positions 69% of the time, compared with just 9% aligned with the United States. And that's even with the 3 freely associated states having deep security compacts with the US. Between 2012 and 2022, China provided about $4.5 billion in pledged aid to and mostly through low-interest loans to the Pacific Island nations, which makes it now the 2nd largest bilateral donor in the region, albeit still way behind Australia as the principal donor. But it also, one of the critical problems with this, because much of what China does arguably is no different from what any other great power or major power might do in that kind of a region. And much of what it does is not necessarily malign. It's simply in competition with other more traditional or established powers who may be uncomfortable with the relatively newer player. But it's not necessarily doing anything outside the rules, if you will. But where its diplomacy becomes complicated is in its calculated and targeted influence campaigns to align Pacific leaders with Beijing's broader goals. Programs like the China-Pacific Islands Political Leadership Dialogue that bring regional politicians into Beijing's orbit. We're actually seeing the International Department of the Communist Party increasingly leading and engaging with these, the United Front Work Department and United Front agencies increasingly involved. And these initiatives promote a narrative that glorifies China's governance model while fostering personal relations with political elites. And its tactics often rely on elite capture that involves using strategic corruption in many cases to cultivate personal relations with decision makers, often through financial inducements or business opportunities. Leaders are offered incentives, sometimes directly, sometimes through proxies, and these efforts bypass traditional institutions and focus on individuals and their personal interests, reshaping decision-making at the highest levels. Unfortunately, small Pacific nations are particularly vulnerable to this type of corruption. They have limited resources and fragile institutions, and so for China, the strategy is both cost-effective and impactful. And it exploits cultural norms in the Pacific in these traditional societies where gifts from leaders to their communities, patronage networks, politics are very small and local and personal in these island societies, most of which are only a few 100,000 in population. But the result ends up being a growing alignment of local elite interests and power structures with China's strategic interests. I heard time and time again as I traveled through the region, to put it bluntly, that the Chinese are going around bribing our officials to do things that they want them to do. It's sometimes much more subtle and cloaked through development projects and opportunities for kickbacks on larger projects, but the number of times that I heard that it was just simply envelopes and bags of cash being handed over, debit cards, for example, for accounts. There's a lot of that kind of thing going on. And especially in these small developing societies, that has a really corrosive effect on governance, accountability, transparency, and in general, socio-political stability, because the people know what's going on and they're increasingly frustrated with it. So China's, as part of course, all that economic engagement, China's economic footprint has expanded rapidly with the Belt and Road Initiative as the overall framework for it. Most Pacific islands have joined the BRI and is building ports, roads, telecommunications projects backed by Chinese loans and firms. So again, following a playbook that anyone who studied China's geopolitics and geoeconomic strategy in Asia is well familiar with, it's replicating that in the Pacific Islands, albeit with limits, because of course they're such small economies. Many of the Chinese mega projects aren't really feasible there. It has to scale down the size of the project it's doing, but it's still made over $3 billion worth of infrastructure investments across the region: airports, ports, roads, public buildings, improving connectivity and economic potential. A lot of benefits from this infrastructure, but they also come with opaque terms, and in many cases have created significant debt burdens for recipient nations, as seen, for example, with Tonga's debt to the Export-Import Bank of China, or Exim Bank, which is about a quarter of its GDP. That economic expansion is more than development. It's developing strategic leverage. The infrastructure projects promise progress, but the dependency ties leaders to Beijing's agenda, compromising their autonomy and their priorities. And so for some countries, there's a risk of debt sustainability, but Chinese lenders in general are unwilling to work collaboratively with other lenders for rescheduling and so on. At the best, usually there's a willingness to extend the timelines on those debts. I'm not going to make the argument that China is deliberately creating debt traps. I think that's an unintended consequence, but the leverage is definitely there and the relationships are definitely being strengthened as a result. It's also driven by an appetite for Pacific resources, which are quite deeply entrenched. About 3.3 billion worth of Pacific resources, mostly mining, minerals, timber, fish, flows to China. It makes it now the Pacific's largest consumer and one of its largest trading partners. At the heart of that is China's distant water fishing fleet, which is also now the largest, and backed by billions in subsidies. It's ballooned from about 50 vessels in 2009 to over 550 by 2020. This dominance comes at a cost. Illegal, unregulated, and unsustainable practices, or IUU fishing, are rampant. These activities erode fish stocks and imperil the livelihoods of countless Pacific communities. Meanwhile, the digital Silk Road is embedding Chinese technologies into Pacific economies. You've got fiber optic networks, Huawei 5G systems, Beidou navigation platforms are becoming staples across the region. And while they enhance connectivity and, of course, are lower cost than many other options, they also raise concerns about surveillance, information control, and even espionage. And we're also seeing increasing Chinese influence on media censorship and disinformation in Pacific media. Lastly, then, security objectives. China's foray into Pacific security sectors is among the most controversial aspects of its strategy, certainly as far as the US and Australia and France are concerned. Its dual-use facilities are central to the strategy. I don't think China is on the verge of establishing a military base in the Pacific, although it would certainly like to if it could. But ports and airstrips, often built under the guise of commercial development, can be useful as places rather than bases for logistical purposes. And those partnerships grant China access to critical national security infrastructures. The classic case is, of course, the secret agreement that China forged in between 22 and 23 with the Solomon Islands. Ostensibly focused on maintaining domestic law and order, the terms allow for the deployment of Chinese security personnel, including military and People's Armed Police, and the potential establishment of permanent facilities, naval port visits, which can be supported by Chinese logistics facilities. And so they really blur the line between cooperation and, to some extent, suasion or coercion, and raise concerns about the long-term implications for regional stability, particularly because the pact had implications for all the Pacific Islands, but it was not consulted widely with any of them. It was presented as a fait accompli. So it raises the question, if China is open about its engagement, why is it being so secretive about agreements like this? Its broader strategic objectives include extending its military reach in the Pacific by securing access to critical infrastructure, embedding itself within Pacific security normative frameworks, and essentially becoming a key actor in the security architecture of the region in rivalry to all the established ones. So what's next? For many Pacific Island countries and territories, the intensifying competition between China and the West is an unwelcome distraction. Their priorities are focused on sustainable development, climate adaptation, and maintaining sovereignty, and they've expressed that through a 2050 Blue Pacific vision, which emphasizes an ocean-centric regional order. The challenge they have is that both the Indo-Pacific concepts of many other states and China's own efforts to create a sphere of influence are constraining their ability to actually shape their own destiny. They face extreme power asymmetries with larger states like China, the US, and Australia. Some are leaning towards Beijing in the case of the Solomon Islands. Most others are trying to balance, and a few are bandwagon or hedging. So we're seeing a fairly sort of classic international relations behavior among the states as they try to get advantages and extract the best benefits they can from both China and its Western rivals. But the challenge is that none of them have ever dealt with an entity like the party state before. And the disparity between their state capacity to manage an actor like that is trying to essentially get into all aspects of their societies in order to be able to manipulate and influence them, really puts them at risk of ultimately not just elite capture and media capture, but ultimately state capture. And I think that's really the goal for China, is to essentially create a dozen client states in that region between the first and second island chains, so that it can interfere with the activities of other governments that have interests there and ultimately shape the region so that it tilts towards Chinese preferences. The Pacific Islands have an opportunity, if they organize themselves effectively enough, to leverage their increased strategic importance to maximize their own agency and secure better outcomes for their people. But to do that, they need to really strengthen and make more resilient their own governance and accountability systems and be more strategic about how they choose to partner with them. What other countries can do is focus on providing them with sustained support, transparent partnerships, more values-driven engagement, and make sure that they have real alternatives. Because one of the easiest ways that China comes and shifts that regional balance is simply because there's a lack of support from other partners that those islands might prefer. So a realistic goal is not somehow preventing China from being a major player in the Pacific Islands. I think that's inevitable and understandable given China's global role. The key is trying to maintain a balance of power and influence that enables the Pacific Islands themselves to navigate and keep their own sovereignty and agency of decision-making. They're at a crossroads about that, and the changes they make today are going to shape their future for decades to come. So it's a discourse that needs to shift from not only great power competition to ensuring the region's sovereignty, regional consensus and unity, and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was an excellent speech, and I think I do agree with most of your assessment, particularly how the Chinese are trying to isolate Taiwan internationally by focusing more and more on the Pacific world. But this also encouraged me to think a little wild. If we really keep the Taiwan issue apart, what are the similarities and complementarity you see in the Chinese strategy in comparison to China's outreach in the Pacific world and China's approach to other remote places like Africa? Because the similar trend is also visible in, as you mentioned, about dual issues, technologies, having a mixture of diplomatic offensive, economic charm offensive strategy, trying to bribe. The similar kind of incidents are also visible in Africa. So maybe we'll come back to you to throw more lights on this. And with this note, let me invite quickly the next speaker, Dr. Petr Topychkanov. He will be speaking more about the nuclear dimension in Indo-Pacific and how is it really shaping the competitive relationship in the regions. Over to you, Petr. Please unmute your. Maybe in the admin, somebody can unmute Dr. Pramod.
Okay, finally it's done. I'm fine. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much. It's my pleasure to see my old friends and colleagues, and sorry to be late because of some technical issues. And probably I missed some points. I'm going to repeat briefly in the context of nuclear competition in the region of Indo-Pacific. First of all, of course, we have to mention that there is a framework of some regimes and limitations existing in this region. And Dr. Koldunova mentioned that. And if to consider the region broadly, broader than just in the Pacific, it's about the nuclear-free zone in Africa, in Central Asia, in Mongolia, and Southeast Asia, and Australia and Latin America. But still, there is a problem with all the zones, existing policy of some countries not to ratify this treaty, and we should mention the United States as well. Another problem with these zones is that they don't have any instruments to observe, monitor, and prevent movement and deployment of nuclear capabilities in this area. So it means that at least what actually means what actually these zones mean. They mean only the policy of these countries and regions not to develop their own capabilities in this area. But the problem in this context, what we face right now, is that other countries, including some countries from this zone, are actively developing their new capabilities, and in some cases, not only in technological and quality dimension, but also in numbers. And of course, the most recent and few years, we are discussing the increase in nuclear capabilities of China, for instance, or of India and Pakistan, and in North Korea. But it's not only the case. The case also is about lowering nuclear thresholds in doctrines. And in the region, we consider several countries updating their nuclear doctrines, trying to face new challenges. And most recently, we could see the new doctrine adopted by Russia, covering not only the Russian territory, but also Belarus as well. And the key point in this doctrine is that Russia decided to consider a nuclear deterrent as a tool to respond not only to attacks by nuclear weapon states, but also by non-nuclear weapon states supported by nuclear weapon states. And of course, it's more of the situation in Euro-Atlantic area, but it's a good example that in the current world, including in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, if you wish, it's not about nuclear deterrence between nuclear weapon states. It's about more complicated, not even alliances, but communities and cooperative endeavors. So from this point of view, I want just to be back to the idea about a new Asian NATO or something like that, including in the Russian literature. We have a number of pieces written about that, such as the United States probably tries to rebuild or build something like an Asian NATO, including Australia, New Zealand, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. But in all these cases, we need to be very cautious about trying to imagine this thing. And even I don't think that these countries are more acceptable about this idea. Just in case, I want to mention the case of Philippines, because its case very important. This year, United States deployed Typhoon launchers capable to launch medium-range missiles, and it's a new development in Asia-Pacific because it's about outcomes of the INF treaty ended previously between Russia and the United States and other member states of the treaty. So this fact may prove the argument that Philippines may be a part of something, a new framework with the United States. And of course, having in mind territorial dispute between Philippines and the United States, we can believe that it may be true. But in the same time, we all understand that Philippines have more multi-dimensional policy. And in this case, for instance, Philippines became the first country signed an agreement with India to get a BrahMos missile. I just want to remind you that the BrahMos, it's a missile jointly developed by Russia and India, and India is a producer, but the engine in this missile is supplied by Russia. And before that, we had a lot of conversations about BrahMos being supplied to other Southeast Asian countries, such as Vietnam. Vietnam was mentioned firstly in this case, but it didn't happen. Vietnam and India is still in the negotiation process about these missiles, but the Philippines already signed, and so it means that it's not just about Philippines-US, something like a bloc or an alliance or a cooperation. It's a more complicated situation. And the case of this missiles development also highlights that nuclear dimension is not only about numbers of nuclear warheads being built by China, India, Pakistan, and being deployed by external powers. But it's about a more complicated sphere of technology, including missiles. And we could face a new wave of missiles competition and arms race, including strategic capabilities in the Asia-Pacific or in the Pacific region. Just a few weeks ago, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybkov mentioned that in the case of development and deployment of US missiles in Asia-Pacific, Russia would consider to deploy its own capabilities, missile capabilities in the region. Of course, we don't know exactly the case which countries may host such missiles, and people could speculate that it's more about North Korea, but I have some doubts about that. But nevertheless, the same argument that in the case of the US deployments in the region, Russia might consider, means that we have some actual risks about future arms race. And it's not just about traditional technologies. Let's just mention the well-known case about AUKUS. AUKUS has started from a traditional area of the cooperation between Australia, UK, and the United States in the area of nuclear submarine production for Australia, developed its dialogue to cover also hypersonic missiles and also military use of artificial intelligence, as it was mentioned in 2022. It means that it's very difficult now to, put a line between nuclear weapons and other strategic technologies. And it's very difficult also to say that this country is totally dependent on this or that center of power, such as, for instance, the United States, China, or Russia. Just take the case of India. And the United States is the first supplier in terms of money of India's military input. But at the same time, India has very strategic projects with Russia, such as including cooperation in nuclear submarine technologies, as it was mentioned in the Russian mass media, and some experts in Russia who mentioned that. And most recently in the Indian press and in Russian as well, it was mentioned that India and Russia are in the process of negotiating supplying land-based strategic radars for ballistic missile defense of India. And it's not just about one radar, it's about the system that India could include into multi-layer missile and air defense that India wants to build and tries to build with the help of other countries, including from the West, such as Israel and the United States. What actually it means for the nuclear competition, and first of all, it means that it's not about building new alliances and military blocks. It's about more flexible and dynamic technological communities. In some cases, the countries from different camps, competitors, can find themselves cooperating together with regional and global powers existing in Asia-Pacific. This is that it's not possible to argue that it's only about nuclear risks and only about nuclear warheads and nuclear capabilities. There is a growing gray zone of technologies of strategic purpose that can affect strategic calculations and make other countries to consider using nuclear deterrent against the situation in response to the situation and the risks. This is a second point. And the third my point is you could see from my presentation that I used different terms such as Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific. It's very hard to imagine or to consider a region with stable borders. We can see, by example, of missile developments in the region, the situation in Europe has a very strong influence on the military development in Asia Pacific. It means that we can discuss Asia Pacific, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Indo-Pacific, and so on. But at the same time, we can see that in the different areas, we should consider different regional frameworks and architectures. And for the Russian policy in the region, the only probably one and the most effective way to deal with this is to trying to build Eurasian space and to connect this to the situation in Asia Pacific. That is why it wasn't a mistake, but somehow an ideological view by Minister Lavrov, who said that Eurasian space continues to Asia Pacific as well. So I would stop here, and I will be happy to continue this conversation during the questions and answers. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think those are interesting remarks and a very complicated topic, and I'm sure there will be some comments and questions. In order to move fast forward, let me invite the next speaker, that is Dr. Roger Liu, to make your presentation, maybe providing a little more Taiwan perspective. How does Taiwan really look today? Russia's role and China's role in Indo-Pacific. Of course, I think Taiwan is really concerned about the way China is expanding its outreach in the regions and trying to, expand its military activities toward Taiwan. But probably it would be more interesting to throw some more lights on Russian aspects. How does it really look? Russia looks at the regions, and how does Taiwan really prepares to deal with the situation? Over to you, Dr. Roger Liu.
Yes, sir. Very nice to see you here, Dr. Panda. And I learned that I'm in the. I hope you can hear me clearly because recently. Okay. My AirPods Pro actually has some issues. I know I'm in a panel of Russia and China related topic, so I was going to present something else, but before I do that, I may talk a little bit about what you have assigned me to talk about regarding the structural distributions of the powers in the Indo-Pacific region regarding Taiwan's expectation towards Russia and China during the time. But I need to share my screen for now. So let me see. Okay. All right. So I will put it over here first. But before I begin, I hope you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Can you? Okay. All right. So, of course, strategically, Taiwan has been interested in the role that Russian armed forces can play for the future, because since 2022 and even before, China has been trying to use its military power by surrounding the island to suffocate us and to convey their political messages. So far, they have done at least 2 rounds of what is called the Joint Sword series of exercises around Taiwan. A and B has been recognized. And recently, there is another one being reported by the media and being revealed by some of our national security officers regarding the Chinese Navy has been sending out a composite fleet with the Chinese Coast Guard along with the maritime militia, and up to 90 ships or the vessels have been dispersed between the second and the first island chain. So, well, of course, I'm not from the military intelligence, so I don't know whether this is happening because there are two versions, at least two versions of stories around here. So far, the military forces being surrounding Taiwan is still done by the PLAN only. And we have noticed that the Russian forces have been joining hands with China in different parts of this area, Indo-Pacific area, to help them or to assist the PLAN militarily. For example, near Japan, we have seen the Russian and the Chinese Navy have been doing the coordinated military exercises. And in ASEAN, in the southern part of the Eurasian continent, actually, there have been, in 2019, actually, the Russian Navy and the ASEAN has conducted the first ever joint exercise as well. So, well, what worries Taiwan is that China and Russia will be joining hands when there is a conflict happening near Taiwan Strait. However, so far we are in mixed messages. So we don't know what will happen for the future. But this is the short response that I have for Dr. Panda. And what I'm going to talk about today regarding all the countries involved in the panel is that it's about export control and economic security, which as a new idea has been developing in India, involving big players like China, like Russia, and like Taiwan as well. So the U.S. has been talking about big yard and porous fence recently regarding especially some emerging technologies with a focus on semiconductors. So what the U.S. has been doing is trying to slow down the process for China to either acquire or to gain the capacity of producing advanced process semiconductors. So from October the 7th of 2022, we have seen a series of export control measures or mechanisms being initiated and published by announced by the BIS, the Business Industrial Security, the Bureau of Industrial Security affiliated to the Department of Commerce of the United States. And at the same time, the US has stepped up the collaboration with India in emerging technology as well, which can be found from the two announcements made by the two governments last year, respectively in June and September 2023. So things are happening. The collaboration among the US and India has been happening at a historical level. However, this is something that will have some kind of potential issues for the future. If you have followed the news, you will find that recently there is a big story taking place between India and the US, which is the smuggling of some NVIDIA chips via a Mumbai-based drug maker, which is called the Shreya Life Sciences, which is traditionally, they have existed for some time, and they seems to be a legitimate and large company. So apparently someone has been using this as a channel to smuggle the banned NVIDIA or control NVIDIA chips from Malaysia and India to Russia for them to train their AI programs. And this has been tracked really carefully by the reporters from the Bloomberg news agency and other news agencies as well. So if you're interested, you can go to the Bloomberg website to take a look, and every detail has been revealed over here. So I think what is important is that this can be a potential conflict between India and the US regarding export control, economic security, and their relations with Russia for the future. Apparently, this is a loophole in the export control. As you can see here, Shreya Life Sciences began exporting computer hardware to Russia in September 2022, including Dell servers with NVIDIA processors. And they have seemingly apparent financial connections with a Russia state-owned bank, and they are doing the payment through that. And finally, the news agency found that Shreya Life Sciences has imported 1,407 Dell servers from Malaysia and rerouted them to Russia. So this actually has raised concerns between especially India and the US regarding India's role for the future. And economic security has become more and more important for the past few months, or not a few years, that, this is actually a serious consequences of the US-China competition, and especially in the high-tech area. And as you can see here, the idea of economic security has not been developed really well for now, because if you check economic securities in different countries, we will find that actually people have different ideas about that. For example, the economic security in Thailand actually is to promote the growth and acquirement of emerging technologies from other countries. However, for a mature economy like Japan, they actually have different ideas. So the idea of economic security actually has been developed and, if not invented, by the Japanese a few years before. So the Japanese actually has established a very sound system for their economic security, along with a legal edifice that covers most of the critical areas in technology. For example, these are the main pillars or areas being covered by the Japanese version of economic security, including the scientific autonomy, supply chain security, critical infrastructure protection, protection of key technologies, information security, international cooperation, and economic sanctions, including investment screening. So these are very comprehensive structure. However, in India, this is still a developing idea. So this is what has been done by the Western countries in the past few months. And India actually has its own original legal framework regarding export control. as you can find it from the Directorate General of Foreign Trade. However, this list, which is referred to as SCOMAT, standing for Special Chemicals, Organisms, Materials, Equipment, and Technologies, actually is quite old. And it is being made from the Wassenaar Agreement era, or even can be traced back to the Cold War era. So in this list, actually, the latest developed technology equipments are not included until the US and India has established more collaborations since last year. So the US-India strategic trade dialogue has been established last year, and they had the first round of meetings talking about different collaborations in high-tech sectors and strategic trade. So a key issue for India is to balance its strategic autonomy with this kind of commitments to economic security demanded from its new partner, which is the United States now. Because as we know, the US has been quite open to the Indian side regarding the acquisition of Russian-made weapons. Like there is a CATSA, especially stressed by the former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, in the year of 2017, that had given a waiver to the Indian side for using Russian-made weapons, such as SAM S-400. However, if this is applied to critical materials such as electronics or semiconductors especially, I don't think India will get a waiver about this. And this is the new thing that you can find here. Now, after the strategic trade meeting between India and the US, the Directorate General of Foreign Trade has made a new version of handbook on India's strategic trade control system. And this is the new one. As you can see here, it's published in January 2024. And in category 8, new items are added. And these new items are mainly about quantum mechanics and semiconductors. So this is quite new. And this is apparently a product after the US-India meeting. However, the India's reaction to the Shreyas Life Sciences case is that, well, most of the stakeholders in this story actually don't care much about that. So we can see that from the latest coverage from the Hindustan Times that US actually has sanctioned nearly 400 entities on October the 30th for this case, including directly 19 Indian firms for supporting Russia's military industrial base. However, you can read from the slide that the responses from the key companies are like they actually either deny that or they don't view this as a very important stuff for them to care about. The Indian government's position actually is that they emphasize that India has strong ties with Russia and no domestic restrictions on trading with Russia will be imposed. So I think a potential issue here, because I've been seeing some kind of conflicts that can be politicized for the future between the two countries. And of course, as a scholar who resided in India for 8 years, I know that India treasures its strategic autonomy very much. And this is very important to do foreign relations policies, to make foreign relations policies without being influenced by any other great powers, including especially the United States. But since the collaboration between India and the US in semiconductors and other emerging technologies going, I think it is very important for India to find a balance between the developments to keep the strong ties with Russia while to keep the commitment with the US on emerging technologies, not to leak to countries like Russia or China, will not be an easy task. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. I think it was very interesting, and it shows that your field study in India of that 8 years of experience and rich thought that you carry about India-US relations. In fact, this is a very technical presentation, and it cleared many doubts about economic security and in what direction the India-US relationship, economic partnership particularly might move. But with your remarks, I think we are a little deficient in terms of knowing how Taiwan looks at the issues. Probably in your comments during the discussion, we could come back to you to share more ideas about how Taiwan is looking at India-US relationship, and particularly the recent improvement in India-China relations. Those are important determinants in the Indo-Pacific narrative currently. So if you could throw some of the slides, that would be interesting. But with this note, let me now invite all the panelists to take up some questions. I'll also invite all of our participants who are attending this webinar to pose your questions in the chat box so that the speakers can see and probably answer those questions. But let me, just to take advantage of the process as a moderator, let me pose one questions to each of the panelists. One questions to each of the panelists, and then invite you to comments for 2 to 3 minutes. I'll start with Professor Chenoy, with you. I mean, again, very interesting presentation about counter reaction and reactions that is unfolding in the Indo-Pacific. My question is that we know for a fact that the Southeast Asian countries are divided in this US-China and China-US rivalry, as well as the China-Russia chemistry that is evolving. Some of the Southeast Asian countries are taking a pause. But what about the South Asian countries? Because in this session, we did not really discuss much about smaller South Asian countries who are actually critical to the Chinese interest as well as the Russian interest. How do you see countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh? Of course, we know Pakistan is much more China-centric partner country in the regions. But when it comes to Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, how do you see the reactions of these countries are going to be towards, evolving towards China-Russia chemistry? If you could throw some lights on that, that will be interesting. Then I will come to Dr. Gudrun Wacker. Interesting time in Germany itself. But during my travel, when I talked to you and your colleagues in SWP and in GIGA and in Brussels, yesterday, we got an impression that probably under the new EU presidency, there will be a lot of focus on Europe per se, to strengthen Europe's foreign policy. And probably there will be a little backtrack on about how EU is looking at Indo-Pacific. There might be a little revisit about that. What is your take on this? How does really Europe moving in 2025 and 2026, given the fact that there is a new EU presidency has come, then there is also a new president in the United States of America. Particularly 2024 has been an election year. How do you see EU's foreign policy evolving towards Indo-Pacific, or not evolving, taking a backseat, and the future connotation out of it? If you could throw some lights on that, that will be interesting. Then I'll come back to the two Russian speakers, Russian colleagues from who have spoken more about the Russian perception. First to you, Dr. Ekaterina. How do you really see that Russia trying to move forward in Indo-Pacific from now on? There has been, as far as I know, whatever I have covered about China, Russia, there is a subtle differences between the Chinese approach and the Russian approach. And the Chinese do not really want Russia to come to Southeast Asia that outrightly. So how does really Russia going to implement its future strategy towards Southeast Asia, which is a critical geoeconomic region for Russia, particularly at a time when war is on and Russia is partly really, outcasted and isolated by the Western world. And Russian approach is to navigate more engagement in the Asian regions. And in that context, how does really Russia look at its engagement with the Southeast Asian countries, particularly countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, Laos, Cambodia? How are these 10 odd ASEAN members really figuring in Russian foreign policy in times to come, given the fact that China would like to still maintain the local dominance in the Southeast Asian regions? So this will be interesting to hear your point of view there. Then Dr. Petr, I think you could actually comment a little more about the nuclear dimension, particularly involving Iran. I mean, in this session also, we didn't discuss much about West Asia or Gulf itself, or Middle East per se, but given the fact that what is happening not only in Israel, Gaza, but also in Syria, I think one aspect which is going to also have severe impact in the Indo-Pacific region is the Iranian approach from now on. We know for a fact that for last 3 years, there is a special chemistry is evolving between Iran and Russia and China, and including probably North Korea. But then, Trump coming back to power in US, how do you really see Iran looking at the Indo-Pacific, and Iran looking at India, Iran looking at Russia and China particularly when nuclear issues are the most prominent and dominant a matter of discussion between Iran and the Indo-Pacific powers. I'll take this opportunity to again invite Michael Kovrig to comment on, the China's game of influence in the massive Pacific island. 2 points. One is that how do you really draw parallel between China's outreach in the Pacific island in comparison to China's outreach in the other sub-regions of Indo-Pacific, let's say Southeast Asia? Do you draw a difference? Have you really covered this aspect? Because some of these issues that you pointed out, that they are bribing and they are trying to influence the context in the regions, those are also visible in other sub-regions of Asia or in the Indo-Pacific. Similarly, we have also seen Chinese doing the same thing in the African region, in the African continent. Not only they have a kind of a big summit with the African continent, but also they are trying to bribe the authorities. They are trying to win the bid and trying to influence the narrative in the African regions. And number two, I think how the Chinese are really preparing to face the minilateral or the quadrilateral initiatives that is emerging, particularly when the Chinese were, for a long time have been concerned about the Quad, that is US, India, Japan, and Australia, but also about the new Squad that has been established in Southeast Asia, in the context of Philippines and all. So how does really China would look at these minilateral forums in the regions, and how China is going to respond to the to this kind of minilateral initiatives? To Dr. Liu, again, fantastic presentation. One point I would like to invite your comments is that, how does really Taiwan presidency look at Trump's approach in Indo-Pacific? Is Taiwan really optimistic, really concerned about Trump coming back to power? How Taiwan is going to deal with the situation in Indo-Pacific, particularly when US has really been a committed actor for the Taiwan's cause, but that may not really be the case with the Trump administration. I mean, we know for a fact that Trump is a business person and he is very bold as a political leader. He can take drastic, step. So whether 1992 consensus is still valid, to what extent, the other consensus that is there between US and Taiwan and US and China is still valid or not. If you could comment on some of these issues, that will be interesting. So I'll start with Professor Chenoy first. Maybe each of the speaker, maybe 2 to 3 minutes, so that we could go for another round if it is if time permits. Over to you, Professor Chenoy.
Thank you. Indeed, this region has not been so focused on because, but it is very important. Now, you know that most of the countries of the global south, they are very focused on, you know, for their domestic, and for that they need development and growth. So in South Asia, actually, if you look at it, there are two models for the South Asians within South Asia. One is how India managed its development, and the other is Pakistan. And in that, foreign policy and their worldview has an input. I'm not saying it's the only thing. There are many reasons why there's a different type of development, and why India has become part of the emerging economies, and why Pakistan is now taking its 23rd, I am rescheduling its 23rd IMF debt. So countries are watching. So what was the difference in these two foreign policies? And I'm not saying foreign policy impacts the political economy or the politics or the development, but it is definitely a component where India, their position was always to balance with other countries. In their beginning years post-independence, when they were a very poor country, colonized, just former colony, just like all others in the region, they took Russian aid to focus on their public sector, which gave advantages to India's capitalist class, and which took off as a result. And then they had this position of non-alignment, linking with the global south. And now they have kind of abandoned it, but they have this multi-vector where, because of their position of strength, they feel they can have good relations with both Russia and the US. And despite the American and European pressure on them to be critical of Russian policy in the Ukraine, they had the strength to say no, they would take their own policy. That was one. Second, between India and China, you know, for years we've had this border issue, and 2020 it actually got much worse when there was a clash. But again, the US put pressure on India that, look, you would be left, no one's going to help you with this, if China, you know, in this war, if you have a war, a bigger war with China, so you should align with us. But again, India said, no, we can manage our border ourselves. And they've had like 30 engagements on the border with the Chinese. Some didn't work. And now there's a disengagement on the border with both sides, where India took a very firm position. They did not want Western or Russian support on this. Of course, we do believe that Russia put some pressure on China because of the broader geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific, that they cannot afford to really have India also as an enemy. It's also a nuclear power. It has a very strong Navy, Army, Air Force, etc. So this is now, of course, you know, it's not warm relations with China, but the fact is India is engaging with China. China has become a major trade partner. So the other South Asian countries have watched this, and they are also looking for engagement with all sides and advantages from all without being a partner, because they've seen what happened to Pakistan and a recent regime change when Imran Khan, their former president, who's in jail, the president, wanted to have some engagement with Russia. The Pakistan army, along with the US, that's our belief, went in for a regime change. And you'd see the leader of the opposition in the worst kind of situation, in a jail for months with all kinds of lawfare. So Bangladesh also has had a regime change, in our view. Of course, you know, regime changes mean it's not just a regime change from outside. It's a fact that there are certain internal weaknesses, which the Bangladesh president also made a lot of errors. But the fact is that Russia was supporting them in nuclear power plants, and the US said, no, you should not have that. And in fact, they turned back some ships and said they would sanction Bangladesh. So things can change, but Bangladesh did want to have and they have a relation with China also. And they don't want, none of these countries want to be engaged in any confrontation between the Chinese and the US. Including the Sri Lankans. Everyone wants to chart out an independent path and a strategic autonomy like what India talks about, or a multi-vector policy. These are the various words which India throws around. We have a multi-vector, we have strategic autonomy, for multipolarity. And these countries, I think, are attracted to it. I mean, you can check with Pramod Jaiswal, who watches these development. So I don't think they want to be engaged in any confrontation between these powers, and they're very comfortable even with the US, as long as the US doesn't put too much pressure on them to disengage their relations with China and Russia. Thank you.
Sure. No, thank you. That is interesting. There are a few other questions in the chat box. In the interest of the time, I would like to read them and also direct it to the panelists. Whoever wants to comment on those questions, please feel free to. So there is this question about what are the implications of Russia's increased military cooperation with China in the Indo-Pacific for regional stability. Then there is a question on how do China's investment in regional connectivity and digital infrastructure shape its influence in the Indo-Pacific? There is a question, how will the growing proximity between India and Russia, coupled with the recent developments in India-China relations aimed at resolving the border standoff, influence India's Indo-Pacific strategy? Then there is a question from Amit Singh, what are the potential countermeasures that China and Russia might adopt collectively or individually to challenge US influence in the Indo-Pacific? So I would, leave it to the panelists. Please pick up your questions if you feel confident to answer the questions. So let's go to Dr. Wacker.
Okay, I start briefly with the European perspective, the new presidency and the new commission we have. I think the highest priority, of course, will be what happens in Ukraine and what the new president in the US will do. This is the primary focus, because if we are left alone with the Ukraine problem and the war that is going on there, this will need a lot of resources and also a strengthening of our foreign policy as the European Union. But apart from that, I see with respect to the Indo-Pacific that this will not wane, because it would have, I was afraid that when Russia invaded Ukraine, that all our attention would go back to the European theater as such, and we would not reinforce our diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, but this did not happen. The EU has strengthened its partnerships, and individual memberships have strengthened their dealings with the Indo-Pacific countries, not only with India, but also Japan, Korea, Australia, Southeast Asia, you name it. There is a lot of activities, diplomatic and even military deployments to support international law are still going on. And the German government, for example, they do a sort of annual report on the progress of implementing the Indo-Pacific guidelines. They do this every year, and it's a good exercise to force them, to keep some attention on this area. I take one of the questions, or try to, from the Facebook. The growing military cooperation between Russia and China, the first impact might be Ukraine, because now the European Commission says that there are drones from China being delivered to Russia via third countries or however, and they end up in being used against Ukraine. So the stability here will be influenced. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the North Korean involvement, this is also very important, but the impact is on the European theater, not directly in the Indo-Pacific. In the Indo-Pacific, I think it will be more important what China decides to do. And we already see a very comprehensive strategic approach in place. And Michael talked about it for the Pacific Islands, but you see this toolbox in play in the entire region. And Taiwan is at the forefront of this, where you see all the instruments at play. Cyber attacks, disinformation, showing of military power, and this will be continued. And the cooperation, the joint exercises with Russia, I see more as a symbolic show of, joint strength. We have friends in the world, we're not isolated, but not having a concrete impact on the stability in the region. That really depends more on what China decides to do. And that depends a lot on how the Ukraine scenario will play out in future. And one more remark on the India-China border skirmishes and the border problem. I think what we see at the moment is a broader charm offensive on the Chinese side, vis-a-vis the Europeans with the visa waiver, including for conferences. This has been extended now to Japan, the visa waiver, and to calm down some of the relations that have been fraught by a lot of friction might also be China's effort to prepare for the Trump 2.0 administration.
Right. No, excellent. In the interest of time, I think I'll request all the remaining speakers to stick to 2 minutes each. We have precisely 8 minutes, so each of the speakers can just comment on 2 minutes. So please go ahead, Dr. Ekaterina.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. You had a question about how Russia is trying to move in the Indo-Pacific, given that China has a strong predominance in the region. I would say that, again, for the sake of time, that Southeast Asian countries have their own voice, and there are 10 countries in ASEAN, plus East Timor in the waiting line, but let's focus on 10 core ASEAN member states. You see that actually, if they were not independent and seeking autonomy in midst of multiple confrontational lines, we would not have seen such rise of interest to BRICS Plus process, for example. So to make my answers short, I think that, of course, everyone understands that China has strong economic impact on Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries do understand that this is a predominant force, but still they have room for maneuver, and still there are areas where Russia is advancing quite practically. And the second point is that actually Professor Chenoy pointed out that there are areas where Russia and China do see eye and eye. Maybe this can be a diplomatic front, but economically Russia is not threatening China, and politically Russia is not threatening China. So far, there is no direct challenge to China. We will be going on our ways in the region. I would not say without any problems or conjunctions, but still I don't see that China is a limiting force right now for Russia in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe next, Petr, you could cover the Russia part then before we come to other issues. You're muted. Okay, maybe Michael can comment first, and then we'll come back to Petr. Over to you, Michael.
Sure, thank you. So I'll jump right in. Your first question was on parallels between the Pacific Island countries and territories and Southeast Asia and South Asia, and likewise Africa. You're absolutely right. I mean, what China is doing in the Pacific Islands is to a large extent a reflection of its global South engagement strategy overall. It's trying to bring on these countries. And in the Pacific Islands, if you think about it, they've got 12 votes in the UN General Assembly. It's essentially a cheap vote bank if you're looking to get global endorsement for a policy. And China's not the only country to apply that. There are also obviously a number of regional specificities, but what China is doing with all of these countries, from Africa across the Indian Ocean into the Pacific, is trying to press them all to join its community of common destiny, its global development, civilization, and security initiatives, its Belt and Road. Increasingly, it wants to have all of these countries in a world system in which it is the main hub, and they have, to a certain degree or others, you can debate it, a tributary status, and that they align more closely with China's interests and preferences than they do with any others. The key difference in the Pacific, I think, is that the power asymmetries are more extreme, but China uses carrots and sticks with those countries as well. So, for example, new friends like Kiribati and the Solomons will get lots of economic inducements and benefits, and countries like Palau or the Marshall Islands that still recognize Taiwan get punishments in things like cancellation of authorization for tourist groups from China to go there, cyber attacks, and constant diplomatic pressure to change their wrong thinking. And I think Nepal, looking at South Asia as an example, Nepal, our hosts here, Bhutan, the Maldives, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, and so on, could all benefit from deeper exchanges, actually, with Pacific Island governments to compare notes and share experiences and better understand that menu of tactics that China is employing and how to protect themselves and how to manage that challenge so that they can continue to extract some of the optimal benefits from relations with China, but protect themselves from the hazards. And then very briefly on your second point about multilateral initiatives or minilateral groupings like the Quad or Squad or other things and so on. I think what China does in response to those is, first of all, it works across all elements of state power to strengthen its own position. It seizes opportunities and it moves in whenever there's an opening. So it saw in the Pacific, it saw openings with the Solomon Islands under Sogavare, with Kiribati under its leader, and then most recently under Nauru, and it seizes those opportunities. So it's always looking and probing for weaknesses and empty spaces. And in terms of the actual minilaterals themselves, my impression is what it does is that it has an alliance splitting playbook of trying, first of all, to discredit the major power, and usually the US, but it may be another one. So the ones that any power that it can't win over, it will try to discredit and debase and imply that it's just using its friends and so on and so forth through propaganda and disinformation. And then towards the other members, it applies a mix of inducements and coercion, so it will tend to put harder pressure on the Philippines or South Korea, or the elements of that minilateral grouping that it sees as less firm, or simply that it feels it has more leverage on. And again, a key tool in all of these cases is elite capture in trying to fracture even a domestic consensus of China policy in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you. That is excellent. Peter, can you speak now?
Yes. Jagannath, thank you so much for your questions. First of all, I just want to remind our listeners a good quote by Michael Tripon, who is one of the best experts on nuclear arms control, multilateral one, about the future formula of nuclear arms control disarmament: no new nukes, no use of nuclear weapons, and no new nuclear testing. So, and I believe that for Iran and for the Russian approach to the developments in the region, this formula is still relevant. And I do want to remind you about the statements by the officials in Iran about that nuclear weapons are against their ideology and so on. But also, it's about the strategic, from strategic point of view. In this situation, when the Iranian position is quite weak after the collapse of the Assad regime, to build something effective as a nuclear deterrent is quite difficult. It's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. And also, it would it would harm the Iranian ability to survive this turbulent time. But what can help this country survive in this situation? Good relations with many different countries, including India itself, because India and Iran are good partners, including as a part of the North-South transport corridor with the port in Iran built with the help of India. And it means that it's exactly the point that I tried to highlight in my presentation. About now, it's very difficult to build blocks and different centers moving regional powers to one corner or another one. That is why Iran has to work with different countries, including try for last few years, Iran was involved in dialogue with the Gulf countries, try to normalize the relations. Of course, nobody knows what will happen after the Trump administration comes, and how the Trump administration and Israel would continue to deal with Iran. And because it's a great unknown, I have no answer to this question. And just a very brief, just few lines about military cooperation between Russia and China and Indo-Pacific. It's a great development that after a long period of time, when Russia cooperated with Asian countries in military technology, being a supplier of military technologies, now it's a question about establishing multiple military cooperation, including with India, with China. It's about military dialogue. It's about the dialogue between Russia and the countries quite different in this area. For instance, Russia has a strategic dialogue with Pakistan and the military dialogue with India. And Russia has a great tool to be transparent in this area, such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where military guys meet quite often to deal and discuss not only regional issues, but global issues as well. And we can see, by example, of the statements by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization about their perspective and vision. And sometimes it's quite useful to follow this and as something like a joint and regional and extra-regional view on global offense and military sphere. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. Roger, yeah, we are already in time, but you have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. You asked about the Taiwan official stance to Trump's coming back to power and whether we are worried, right? So I think, well, if you take a look at his interview with NBC's Meet the Press days before, he said that when he was asked that would he commit to defend Taiwan, he responded like, I won't say, because Trump says I have to negotiate with things with Xi Jinping. So some people in Taiwan started to compare that with what Joe Biden has made commitments to Taiwan. However, I think it's beyond only words, because we can look at that from two perspectives. The first one is that if you check Donald Trump's candidates for key positions of his China policy for the future, you will find that these people are all hawkish. From Michael Waltz, the candidate for NSA, Marco Rubio, he's a hawkish guy. Pete Hegseth, I don't know whether he will be qualified because he have a lot of scandals around him. However, if we look at others like Mike Huckabee, who is going to be ambassador to Israel, especially Alex Wong, who is going to be the Deputy National Security Advisor on Taiwan-China affairs, these are all hawkish people. So it's hard to say that Donald Trump will give up Taiwan. And the second thing is that the U.S. actually has been doing the supply chain regionalization and restructuring. And during the time they need Taiwan desperately, especially TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And after the completion of the restructuring of supply chain, I don't think U.S. will let go Taiwan. Even for the years to come, Taiwan is too important for U.S. to ignore in emerging technology like AI and semiconductor.
Thank you. I won't take much time because there are other sessions which is in schedule. So we are over 5 minutes from the scheduled time. But let me take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for your enriching remarks and excellent discussion today. I think this has been a useful session in covering the wider perspective from the regions, from different parts of Asia from Asia to Europe. So thank you very much for engaging in this discussion. How does the politics in the regions, particularly the role of China and Russia is emerging in the regions? On behalf of Dr. Pramod Nais, I thank all of you for joining and also privileged to be here and chairing this session. Thank you very much and have a good Sunday and probably see you in some other occasion.